He walked in wearing a plain jacket and worn-out boots, just a black man with quiet eyes and a cane. The bank manager barely glanced at him before picking up the phone. But no one in the building expected who would walk through the door next. A four-star general in full uniform, medals gleaming, face thunderous, and everything changed. James Turner adjusted the brim of his cap as he stepped out of his old Ford truck and walked slowly toward the entrance of Rivergate Bank. The early winter wind brushed against his weathered face, and his cane tapped rhythmically on the pavement. Dressed in a simple brown jacket and jeans, he didn't look like much, just an aging man with tired eyes and a slight limp. But behind those quiet features was a decorated veteran, a man who had served his country for 4 decades, through to wars, multiple deployments, and countless sacrifices. That morning, all he wanted was to deposit his monthly VA check and speak to someone about a small home improvement loan. His roof had been leaking for months, and he figured it was time to finally get it fixed. As he stepped inside the bank, he noticed how the few people there barely gave him a glance, but the manager behind the glass door did. She stared a moment longer than necessary, her expression tightening. James took a seat in the waiting area and waited patiently as a teller finished with a customer. A few minutes passed. Then the manager emerged and walked over, offering a tight, forced smile. "Can I help you with something?" she asked. James stood, handed her the envelope with his check, and politely asked to speak with someone about the loan. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Wait here a moment," she said, and turned back toward the staff area. James sat down again, not thinking much of it. He'd dealt with cold looks before. Sometimes people saw a black man in old clothes and assumed the worst. But he had learned over the years to stay calm, to let his actions speak. He had led entire battalions under fire. He had written letters to families who had lost sons. A little suspicion didn't shake him anymore. Still, it stung, somewhere deep, to always have to prove he was more than what they saw. What he didn't expect was the sound of police radios crackling through the air a few minutes later. 2 uniformed officers entered the bank. One scanned the room while the other walked straight toward James. "Sir, we received a report of a suspicious individual causing concern," the officer said, his tone firm but cautious. James blinked, then looked around in disbelief. "Suspicious," he repeated, confused. "I'm just here to cash my VA check." He reached into his jacket slowly and pulled out his military ID, along with a worn wallet filled with other service cards. The officer took the ID, read it, and paused. "James Turner, Army, yes," James said. "Retired, 40 years of service." There was a long silence. People in the bank began whispering, some peeking over their shoulders. The bank manager reappeared, now looking uneasy. James sat back down, shoulders heavy, heart sore. It wasn't the first time he'd been judged by his appearance, but it hurt more every time. Not because he was afraid, but because even after giving everything to his country, he was still seen by some as a threat, not a man. As James sat silently in the corner of the bank lobby, the weight of humiliation pressed heavily on his chest. He tried to steady his breath, but the stares from the other customers and the sharp presence of the officers made it hard to focus. One officer still stood near him, occasionally glancing at the ID in his hand, while the other leaned against the counter, speaking quietly to the bank manager. James didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. His dignity, worn and tested over the years, kept him calm, but inside he was hurting. 40 years of honorable service and medals couldn't stop a single assumption from dragging him back into the shadows of suspicion. Across the room, an older woman, perhaps in her 70s, watched the scene with growing disbelief. She had been a regular at the bank for years and had seen all kinds of people come and go. But something about this moment disturbed her deeply. She stood up from her chair and walked over to the teller. "What's going on?" she asked. "Why are the police here?" The teller, unsure how to respond, nervously whispered something about a possible threat and security concerns. The woman looked over at James, then back at the teller. "That man," she asked, voice rising. "That man is a threat. He's sitting there peacefully, probably older than all of us, and you called the police." The room grew quiet. The officer with James had started to realize something was wrong. He looked again at the ID card in his hand, and then turned to James. "Mr. Turner, I just want to confirm, were you ever stationed overseas?" James nodded, his voice steady. "Yes. Iraq, Afghanistan, Panama. I commanded troops in all of them." The younger officer felt a pang of shame. "Sir, I apologize. I'll need to make a quick verification call. Please excuse the trouble." The officer stepped outside, pulled out his phone, and made a call to a military contact listed in the veteran registry. Within minutes, his eyes widened. He looked back at the building, then hurried to his patrol car and radioed in something urgent. Minutes passed. The tension inside the bank lingered like a thick fog. Then, with no warning, a black government SUV screeched to a halt in front of the building. The doors flew open, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out wearing a formal army uniform, chest gleaming with medals. 4 stars sat on each shoulder, the unmistakable mark of a general. He stormed into the bank with purpose. The moment he saw James, his face softened. "Colonel Turner," he said, walking straight to him and extending his hand. "Sir, are you all right?" James slowly stood and shook his hand. The bank manager looked like she had seen a ghost. The general turned, scanned the room, and then addressed the officers, the staff, and everyone watching. "This man is a national hero. He's a mentor, a leader, and a patriot, and he deserves your respect, not your suspicion." Silence followed. Everything had changed. The room that once judged him now stood in stunned silence, unsure how to undo what had just been done. The silence in the bank was deafening. No one moved. The general's voice, though calm, carried the sharpness of a battlefield command. "This man," he repeated, gesturing toward James, "is not just a veteran. He's the reason I'm alive today." The general's name was Marcus Hill, one of the most respected military leaders in the country, decorated, feared, admired, and now standing like a wall beside James Turner. The man so casually humiliated moments earlier. General Hill's tone shifted from calm to fierce. "You called the police on him for sitting here quietly, for being black and needing a loan. What kind of nation do we claim to be when this is how we treat our heroes?" The bank manager stuttered, sweat forming at his temples. I didn't mean I was just following protocol, sir. It seemed suspicious, and we have procedures suspicious." Hill snapped. "Because he wore worn clothes? Because of his skin color? Or because you couldn't imagine a man like him walking in with dignity and needing nothing more than what he earned?" His words cut like steel. The two police officers remained quiet, now clearly uncomfortable, both avoiding eye contact with James. One of them stepped forward, face flushed. "Sir, we didn't realize who he was. We're sorry." General Hill didn't soften. "That's the problem. You needed a title, medals, or a famous name to see his worth. You didn't see the man in front of you. You saw a threat. And now that you're embarrassed, you want to apologize. That doesn't fix the years of this same story repeating." He turned to James. "I'm sorry, sir. You should never have to face this again." James, still calm despite the storm swirling around him, finally spoke. His voice was quiet but heavy with emotion. "I didn't expect special treatment," he said. "I just wanted to be seen as a man, as someone who gave his life to this country. Not to be questioned, not to be feared, just seen." The older woman who had stood up earlier now had tears in her eyes. She walked over to James and took his hand. "You have more grace than all of us," she said softly. "Thank you for everything." The general looked around once more, then walked up to the bank manager. "You'll be hearing from higher authorities," he said coldly. "This incident won't go unnoticed." Then to the staff and customers, "Let this be a lesson. Heroes don't always come in shiny suits or with perfect grammar. Sometimes they walk among you quietly, scarred, tired, and still proud. See them." With that, he guided James toward the door. The entire room stood still as the two men walked out together, one leaning slightly on his cane, the other walking tall at his side. But in that moment it wasn't rank or medals that defined them. It was the unshakable bond of two soldiers, united by honor, walking away from a place that had failed to see the truth until it was too late. Outside the bank, the cold air felt different, not just because of the weather, but because of what that had just happened inside. James walked slowly beside General Hill, both men quiet for a moment. The general broke the silence. "You didn't deserve any of that, but the way you handled it with dignity, with silence, you taught them more than any speech could." James nodded, his eyes focused on the ground. "I'm tired, Marcus. Tired of being invisible until someone else tells them I matter." The general placed a strong hand on his shoulder. "You've always mattered. It's time the world remembers that." Word spread like wildfire. A customer inside the bank had captured the entire scene on her phone and uploaded the video to social media. Within hours, it was everywhere: news channels, veteran forums, civil rights groups. People from all backgrounds, races, and political beliefs were shaken by what they saw. A silent act of profiling shattered by an unexpected reunion between a forgotten veteran and one of the most powerful generals in the country. The video was raw. James never raised his voice. He didn't curse or lash out. He simply sat, wounded not in body, but in spirit. And it was that calm pain that moved millions. The bank, under massive public pressure, issued a formal apology. The manager was suspended, pending an internal investigation. In the days that followed, the company announced it would implement nationwide anti-bias training and launch a Respect Our Veterans initiative, funded partly by its own board. But for James, the apology, while appreciated, wasn't the real victory. What mattered more were the hundreds of letters he began to receive. Some came from other veterans, many of whom shared similar experiences. Some were from children who had seen the video in school and wrote notes saying thank you and calling him their hero. And some came from strangers who simply said, "I saw you. I'm sorry I didn't see men like you before." General Hill invited James to speak at West Point, where he shared his story with a new generation of soldiers, dressed in a suit and tie, standing before rows of cadets. James spoke not about war, but about the battle that continued even after the uniform came off. "You wear the flag," he said, "but never forget when that flag is folded. We carry the weight of service alone." and how we treat those who carried it before us, that's the true measure of a nation." His words were met with a standing ovation. Later, he was honored with a Lifetime Service Medal from the Veterans Affairs Office, recognizing not just his military record, but his courage in standing tall against injustice. James Turner didn't seek fame. He didn't want revenge. All he wanted was to be seen. And now, the world finally saw him not as a threat, not as a stranger, but as what he always was, an American hero. Months passed since that cold morning at Rivergate Bank, but the ripple it caused continued to move across the nation. James Turner's life changed in quiet, powerful ways. He was now recognized not just in his small town, but across the country. Strangers greeted him with respect. Children asked him questions about his time in service, and veterans began sharing their own long-buried stories. Yet James remained the same soft-spoken, humble man. He still walked to the local cafe every morning for coffee, still sat on the same park bench in the evenings. But now, there was a different look in his eyes, not pride or satisfaction, but something deeper, a quiet peace. He used his new platform not to criticize, but to educate. James began volunteering at local schools, speaking to students about service, dignity, and the dangers of judgment. "It starts small," he would tell them. "The way you look at someone, the way you speak to them. Respect isn't just earned, it owed to every person until they prove otherwise." His message wasn't angry, it was healing. And because of that, people listened. General Hill remained in close contact, often inviting James to military events, where he was honored with standing ovations and tributes. One afternoon, during a Veterans Day ceremony in Washington, the general stood before a massive crowd of soldiers, citizens, and government officials. With the Capitol in the background, he turned toward James and said, "This man taught me how to lead, not with orders but with silence, patience, and heart. I owe my life to him, and our country owes him its respect." James, moved but uncomfortable with the spotlight, stepped forward. He didn't prepare a long speech. He simply said, "If I had one wish, it would be that the next time a man like me walks into a place, any place, he's met with a handshake, not handcuffs, with a smile, not suspicion. We've all got work to do, and it starts with how we treat each other, especially when no one's watching." That day, a photo was taken, James standing beside General Hill, saluting the flag. Behind them, rows of cadets stood at attention. It became a symbol of hope across the country, a moment that reminded people what honor really looks like. Not always in shiny uniforms or polished speeches, but in quiet endurance, in walking back into the world with grace after being knocked down. Years later, when James peacefully passed away in his sleep, tributes poured in from every corner of the nation. He was buried with full military honors, flags lowered to half-staff. At his funeral, General Hill delivered a final salute, his voice steady but full of emotion. "You stood taller than any rank could measure," he said. "You were the quiet giant of our time." And as taps played over the still cemetery, it wasn't just the soldiers who saluted. It was a country that had finally learned to see the man who had always been there, patient, proud, and worthy of honor. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to The Black Struggle for more powerful and true stories that need to be heard.